Good afternoon, everyone. We have partnered with the Portuguese flagship program and the Center for Global Business at the Macomb School of Business to organize this conversation about issues that are at the core of international education and global collaboration. In this case, we will be talking about cultural differences between US and Brazil, with two experienced cross-cultural facilitators and authors from UT Austin. Deidre Mendez is an intercultural consultant, speaker, and author, and the current director of the Center for Global Business at the Macomb School of Business. She has facilitated global teamwork among participants from 4 continents, and she's currently responsible for implementing global strategies for the Macomb School, creating international opportunities for UT faculty and students and alumni. We are also welcoming Professor Orlando Kelm, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. His current research focuses on the creation of instructional materials, including the use of innovative technologies in foreign language instruction. He currently serves as the director of the Portuguese flagship program at UT Austin. Before we start with this discussion, I want to remind you that we will be collecting questions via Facebook or via the QA box in the webinar. And we want to encourage you to post your questions as early as possible. This video will stay here on Facebook, and we will also post it on YouTube so you can share later with colleagues and friends. Professors Mendez, Professor Kelm, go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is fun to be with you. You know, I was thinking as we were starting this, Deirdre, that it was 44 years ago that I first started going to Brazil. And so this has been a big hunk of my world to interact with people in Brazil for over 40 years. And it is such an important part of actually who I am, even in terms of everything that has happened over that time. And so to be able to talk about some of these cultural issues related to North America and Brazil is kind of the history of my life in a lot of ways. So I'm very, very happy to be able to share this time with you.
And this is super fun for me because you have such wonderful stories, and then I get to relate those to the structural approach that I developed and teach, and talk about sort of how to deconstruct the experiences that we have every day doing intercultural business. So this is going to be fun for both of us.
And that's kind of what we're going to do. I'm going to tell the stories, and then you kind of explain what it all means.
Right. All right. So we're going to start. I'll let you explain this, this photo.
Well, sure. Now, this photo already is a perfect example of some of the ways that people communicate, because this is a sign in the subway in São Paulo. And what it shows is they're trying to give the rules of behavior in the subway. And it says here that your bike makes your life a lot easier, but it can kind of mess up the lives of other people. And that's kind of their sweet, soft way of saying, don't bring your bike here. And I just thought it was a perfect example of that communication style that you find so much among Brazilians, which is kind of that soft approach, as opposed to do not bring your bike here, right? And so that's why I thought it'd be an appropriate photograph to start us off with.
Super, and we'll actually talk about that kind of example soon. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be, how we've set things up, we'll talk a little bit about some background information on Brazil and the US that may be useful to people who are crossing those cultural boundaries. And then Orlando will give us an intercultural example, and I will discuss the tendencies that are the cultural tendencies that are responsible and ways to recognize them, and the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. And then together we will discuss strategies for managing cultural differences.
Good plan. Well, even before we start, I thought it'd be nice to have a little reality check. And that is because a lot of times when I hear people talk about the United States versus Brazil, we make some assumptions that may or may not actually make sense, because we're imposing either our Brazilian concept on North America or our North American concept on Brazilians. And so I wanted to maybe just before we even get going say, yes, but let's look at a couple of things. So for example, how much do Brazilians actually speak English? And the truth of the matter is that English language proficiency among Brazilians is pretty low. As compared to other countries where I've been to, you don't find a lot of people that actually speak English well. And now that may be true for some of the upper level management type positions, but pretty quickly you find people don't really know English all that well. And the same thing happens with Portuguese. That Portuguese has been identified as a critical language with a critical need in the United States because there simply aren't a lot of people that speak Portuguese. And so that expectation to find somebody who is fluent in English or fluent in Portuguese may be a little disappointing. I know that whenever I go to museums in Brazil, I don't see very often an English translation of what's in the museum, where I do see that in many countries where I travel. So in terms of that reality check, just realize that neither country has a high level of proficiency in the other language. And then Brazil is large. You know, it's the largest, it's half of Latin America in its population, in its size, and in the economy. There are just a lot of people there, and they all live along the coast. São Paulo, greater São Paulo has over 20 million people. I mean, the state of Texas has 29 million people. You can practically put the population of Texas in the city of São Paulo. Have that be a reality check for a second. And then other cities like Rio has 13 million, Belo Horizonte has 6 million, Brasilia has 6 million, Recife has 4 million. These are just large urban sort of population centers. And you compare that to Texas, where our largest city is Houston at 2.3 million. So it really gives you a sense of just how dense the population is in Brazil compared to the United States. The other stat I think it's good to look at is look at the median monthly salary. You know, we hear all the time that Brazil has an increased middle class. But still, the median monthly salary in Brazil is $1,700, as opposed to the United States, which is $7,900. So we can say the word middle class, but it has a very different meaning from one country. So as we talk about all the issues, we just wanted to have that little tiny reality check first of make sure we don't make assumptions about certain things that may or may not actually pan out. And with that, I think we can get rolling, Deirdre.
All right, super. So what I wanted to mention before we start talking about details is that it's really important to avoid generalizations about any country. And when business people from one place start doing business in another place, they often look for doing business in country X books. And those can be really helpful. The danger, though, is that some of them, in an effort to be succinct and get as much information in one place as possible, they tend to suggest, whether directly or not, that everybody in the country that you are working in is going to behave the same as everybody else. And obviously, we know from our own experience in our own country that that is not true. But it's really important to have that in mind. We don't do business with countries, we do business with companies and teams and individuals. Another thing that's really important is that every tendency that we talk about today, and we're going to talk about 6 different ones, is present in every country, different in different age groups, different regions, different ethnic groups, and so on. And the US and Brazil are both tremendously diverse countries with different, very different regional perspectives and very large immigrant populations. So you cannot assume that people will behave the same way, really from one individual to the next. So it's important not to assume, but to think of yourself more as an investigator. Your goal should not be to think that you understand much about the cultural orientation of your partner, but rather to think of yourself as a person who's going to go in and find out what that cultural orientation is. And the best way that I found to do this is to explain your approach and ask about theirs. So if you walk into a meeting and say, you know, when we think about partnership, here are the things we're looking for. Here are the things we prioritize. Here are our expectations of interaction, collaboration, legal matters, duration of the contract, all of those things. If you begin to explain yourself in that way, then you give them an opportunity to say, oh, well, we actually do it differently. Here are our priorities, and here is our approach and our method and our steps. And once you do that, you can identify two important things. One is, where are the differences? And those might trip you up or cause problems. So you want to recognize them early on. And the other is, where are the similarities? Where is the overlap? Because there's a tremendous opportunity to take those commonalities and build on those. And it's only when you ask those questions that you'll realize that. So the examples that we give you will be things you might look for in your partner. And if you don't find them, then you go in a different direction. There's certainly no guarantee that this is the sort of thing you will find. The other point that I want to make that's really important is that whatever cultural tendency you identify in any partner anywhere in the world, that tendency has strengths. It offers advantages to your partnership that you don't bring. Your tendency has strengths, and the opposite tendency has different strengths. And by combining the two in a productive way, you bring the best of both sets of strengths to the table to serve your partnership. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some specifics.
Right. And Deirdre, your point is so well taken, which is, we can't put in the same bag everybody from New York to California to Texas to North Dakota and just say they're all exactly the same. And we don't have to look any farther our own families. We see this. We always have an uncle or a cousin or a grandma who is totally different from everybody else. And we're going to find the same thing when we talk to people who are from the United States or Brazil that way. But as a pattern or a tendency, one that I've noticed over the years is the way that Brazilians communicate as opposed to the way that we as North Americans generally communicate. And what I'd say is that when I'm with Brazilians, a lot of times there is an immediate communication that is positive that says, we're going to do this. We can get going on it. We'll work on the details later, but they give you right away this sense of supporting you. Where on the United States side, what I see is before we commit, let's make sure we've looked at all the facts and the figures, and let's tell you what we're going to be able to do. And so there's more of that direct sort of, can we do it? Can we not discuss it? As opposed to the Brazilian side, which has more of an approach of, we can do things, and we're going to work on those details a little bit later. The best example I can give is if you are lost on the street here in Austin, Texas, and you say, how do I find blah, blah, blah bank? If you don't know, you say, I don't know. And then you say, thanks anyway. And you go ask somebody else. My experience in Brazil is if you ask somebody where that bank is, chances are they're going to say, just a second. Maria, come here. This man's looking for a bank. And then they'll do something to try to help you because they want to give that impression of there's going to be an expectation to help along the way. Be aware that that is kind of the tendency in general, that in North America, we look the parameters and study them and then boldly say and state that outright. And Brazilians are going to put a positive spin on those things and kind of work on the details a little bit later. Now we have an example of that here in the next slide. And that is recently at the University of Texas, we've been collaborating with colleagues at the Federal University in São João del Rei. They are going to be creating for us a number of virtual courses for our students to be able to participate in their classes as well. And when we approached this idea with them, immediately their response was, yes, we can do that. And then as time goes on, now we're looking at, okay, can we get the details about some of how it's going to be structured? What are the details? How it's organized? Who's going to be involved? What is the budget? And what we find is those things are communicated less readily because they really aren't known yet. Where in a North American conversation, you may want those details up front. They're communicated right away from the US side. From the Brazilian side, just trust your partner. They're going to work on them, but they won't be communicated as readily at the initial stages. What I appreciate is their ability to work on it and say, we're going to make it work. And I believe them And my experience has been totally positive when I allowed them that time to do it. If I force them to communicate it out loud with details before it's done, you kind of put them in a corner a little bit. And so that is my situation, and that's my experience in terms of that communication process. And I think Deirdre now can probably why I feel the way I do and what's really going on.
So this story is a great example of cultural tendencies that I refer to as indirectness and directness. So indirectness is about prioritizing a positive mood and upbeat feeling among people, and by making sure that everything you say kind of comes out in a positive way. And it can have the lovely effect that Orlando was describing. You always feel supported and that things are going to work out. One of the downsides that you can encounter with indirectness is that people are very, very cautious and unwilling necessarily to engage in confrontation. So if they don't like your idea, you might not hear about that. You might just hear that the idea sounds pretty good, and then nothing happens. And if you are an indirect communicator, you would communicate this with your body language, maybe with vagueness, by not giving those details that would be necessary to make it actually happen. And another indirect person would understand that. On the other hand, if you're a direct communicator, you're not used to looking for body language and vagueness and tone of voice. You might take words that are said at face value. And you might interpret, if you say, what do you think of this idea? And the other person says, I think it's a good idea. That might mean to you, oh, this is going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, you may be surprised and disappointed. So indirect people always thinking about relationships, being cautious about confrontation. Direct people wanting to be clear, and they feel honest. They feel that it is the most honest way. If something's not going to work out, just tell them, nope, that won't work. Let's move on to something better. They think this is more efficient. So the two, for any two tendencies that are different in this way, there's a judgment associated with each one. Indirect people find direct people kind of brutal, a little bit aggressive and confrontational and difficult to be around, unpleasant. Direct people dealing with indirect people can find that not getting the whole truth every time and getting maybe sugarcoating is the way they put it, is a little bit dishonest and not very helpful. But I want to point out again that each of these tendencies has strengths that you can leverage in a cross-cultural relationship. Indirect people are thoughtful. They maintain positivity. They are focused on personal relationships. And should there be, if your team or your project has a difficult partner to communicate with, or a difficult shareholder or customer, you can leverage the tact that your indirect collaborators will have. Direct speakers are clear and efficient and easy to understand. And if it's time for you to get serious and give somebody the bad news, whereas indirect speakers will kind of want to beat around the bush and be cautious about it, the direct speaker will come out and say, hey, this isn't going to happen. This isn't working. Things need to change, and you can move on quickly. So that's the potential synergy between those two types. So Orlando, I think you have another example.
Yeah, and going back to this one about directness and indirectness, I've seen it over and over again, that if you're a direct person, you want to hear it actually said. And if you're an indirect person, you hint at it. And those two people got to get together that way. Okay, pattern number 2, and it's related, and this is my experience of how things get done over time when it comes to planning. Because from the North American side, I hear over and over again people saying, you Americans plan with so many details, short-term plans, long-term plans, benchmarks, outlines with every step detailed. We want to know exactly what's going to happen at every step of the way so that we're not surprised in the end, so that we can chart the progress and know we've made progress, to have data that says this is what we're doing. You know, that doesn't work everywhere, because sometimes it's hard to prepare for the future. And so what I experienced with Brazilians is that they have lived through 50, 60 years of not always knowing exactly what the future is going to bring. And if you don't know what the future bring, then it's harder to plan for that future. And so everything is really more of a, well, let's keep on going. Let's change it as time goes on. Let's hang in there and keep working with it. You know, for those of you who are Brazilians that are watching this, you have this great phrase, dar jeito, a little jeitinho. Add a little style, finagle this a little bit, make it work out. How are we going to do that? By hanging in there and adjusting to whatever is there, keeping all those options going, being as flexible as we can to encounter whatever's going to come up along the way. And one of the results of that is that Brazilians seem to be just amazing at bringing it all together in the end. Where every time I work with a Brazilian group, there'll be others that are thinking, are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? And I always say, hang in there with them. They are going to shine. And they often do. At the very end, they put it all together and they make it shine. That is really different from a North American style, which is give me step by step what's going to happen all along the process. Those two things sometimes clash along the way. And I have an example of that too in the next slide, which is recently with our flagship, we have been organizing internships for all of our students who will be working with various companies in Brazil. And so we sent out a call to another number of companies to say, would you be willing to receive our students? Yes, no problem. We then try to line them all up. Who's going to be with what company? Who's going to do what? What are their responsibilities going to be? Who are they going to work with? You know, we were asking for all of these details of how it was going to work. And from the Brazilian side, it was much more an issue of, yeah, we'll get her done. And in the end, they are. They are doing a wonderful job of putting it all together. But we really didn't get the details of what some of the people here at the University of Texas wanted initially. And I remember talking to them saying, hang in there, this is going to work out. And they were all kind of like, you sure it's going to work out? Yeah, it's going to work out. I totally appreciate that these companies are receiving our interns. They're having a great experience in a very practical business sort of environment. All important. It's more than I could ever hope for. And for me to demand details before they were ready to put them together just isn't going to happen. It would have frustrated them. It would have frustrated us. And instead, by hanging tight, we knew it was going to come along. And sure enough, they've all come along. And it's been a great experience for the students so far. They're like 3 or 4 weeks into the end. And we're still working out some of the details, but they're all going to happen along the way. So that's my example. Deirdre, tell us what it means.
All right, so I love that example, and I love the cultural dimension that this represents. This story is a good example of what I refer to as flow and schedule tendencies. And flow tendencies are just what you described earlier with the Brazilian group that you're working with. People who operate in fluid environments where infrastructure and events and systems and processes and policies are constantly fluctuating become very creative and very able to adapt to changing circumstances. So they don't take anything for granted on the front end, and they don't assume things are going to happen on at a particular time. Instead, they kind of think in modular terms, like we need to do this, and we need to do this, and we need to do this. Who knows when we'll have a good opening to do this thing versus this thing. But whenever that opening comes, we'll slide the correct thing into that space. And so they don't know when it's going to happen. They just know they're going to be watching for that opportunity. So rather than worry a lot about specific times and dates, they generally have this sort of grab bag of things that they want to accomplish, and they're going to accomplish them as they can. So in flow environments, it's typical for a 10 o'clock meeting, maybe to start at 10:15. And then there are people who sort of come in or maybe closer to 10:30, and people who leave at 10:20 because they need to take a phone call or whatever. And when it comes to deadlines, final deadlines are more important than internal deadlines. So this is Orlando's example was a great example of this, where it's going to get done, but it's not going to get done in clear-cut, distinct increments that can be predicted in advance. So on the other hand, schedule-oriented people plan everything from the beginning, and schedule orientation is strongest throughout the world in places where infrastructure is strong and dependable. The bus is going to get there on time. The road is not going to be washed out. The building will have electricity. The website will explain all the details. When that kind of infrastructure is in place, then you see schedule orientation, which is why it's very strong in Germany, Scandinavia, Switzerland, and it also tends to prevail in the US, although we all know people who aren't always on time for everything. But in the US, they get a bad reputation, right? Because we are not so sympathetic to that perspective, because schedule orientation is strong. So schedule orientation involves planning on what you're going to do, and then working backwards over time to plan all the steps involved. Schedule-oriented people are the ones who plan their vacation. So on Thursday, we're going to have breakfast at this place, and then we're going to go to the museum, and we're going to get out promptly at 11:45 because we have a noon reservation for lunch at such and such a place. And they even schedule in their free time, right? So you get a schedule in a place like that. You get a schedule that says from 4 to 5 p.m. free time before the cocktail reception or whatever. That's schedule-oriented planning. And when schedule-oriented people execute a process, they want to do the same amount of work every day. They don't want to do most of the work at the end. And they become increasingly anxious as you get closer to the end. And so schedule-oriented people are going to be the ones who want to say, where are we now? Has this been done? When's that going to be done? And so on. So you can see, I think all of us have probably worked, whether we're schedule or flow oriented, we've already worked with somebody from the other side, and we know what those kinds of problems are. I want to point out the strengths of each approach. The flow orientation has tremendous value in that flow-oriented people are creative problem solvers. They're good troubleshooters. If something changes, they don't panic, they just move stuff around. So they're good in a crisis. So if your project is operating in an environment where there's any kind of change, any kind of shift, uncertainty, and what project doesn't operate under those circumstances, these are really good skills to have. On the other hand, schedule orientation means that people are going to be watching to make sure that things are coming along, and they're going to take the initiative to make sure that things are getting done throughout, so that you don't have a pileup at the end, and the end of a project can be used to fine tune, do quality control, and all of those sorts of things to make sure that the final product is fully formed and fully developed. So a partnership between schedule and flow oriented organizations or individuals shows both thorough execution throughout, good planning, and creativity and flexibility in face of a crisis. One thing that I noticed when when I worked with Brazilian and German teams, when something changed, the focus of the German participants would be the schedule. They would say, well, that's going to mess up the schedule. That's not in the schedule. We're going to have to trash our schedule and start all over again. It was all about the schedule. And the Brazilians would say, oh, well, let's move this around. You do this, I'll do that. Okay, let's go out for a latte. And that over time, the two sides began to appreciate each other a lot more. Brazilians, in my experience, are often accused of being uncommitted because that's what a lack of punctuality looks like to schedule-oriented people. And it's only after they have pulled a rabbit out of a hat and done some amazing thing in the face of a crisis, that their schedule-oriented counterparts begin to really get that the commitment is to the outcome, not to the schedule, but the commitment is still there. Okay.
You know, one of my favorite examples of scheduling is how many Brazilians have asked me over the years, well, I kind of get you want to know when a party begins, but how do you know when a party ends? Because they'll receive an invitation to a birthday party that says the party will be from 2 to 5 o'clock. And they'll look at me like, how do you know when a party ends? Well, because that's what the invitation said, so you can plan. Just baffles certain people. Let's go on to pattern number 3 here, and that is talking about some of the ways that we build relationships and interact with people. One of the very interesting aspects of working with North Americans is that we are fairly informal. You know, people call me Orlando by my first name. It's no big deal. I don't wear a shirt and tie all the time. And that casual, friendly style gives an impression that you are going to build this relation that's going to be strong and long lasting and can be depended on for a long, long time. Because from the Brazilian side, building a relationship is a big deal, and emphasizing who you're working with is a big deal. And knowing in a changing world that you can depend on certain people you've always worked with is very helpful. And so if you have this expectation that the same thing is happening on the other side, because this person is being so friendly and so interactive and so casual, but then once the project is done and that project focus is completed, sometimes we move on to the next project and leave behind the exact people we were working with before. This can cause quite a little jumble in your brain. From the North American side, it might be, well, why are we expecting more than that? Because we had this project and we got it done. And from the other side, it might be, well, this guy just abandoned me once the project was done. There really is this issue of how much is the focus on the actual project versus how much the person you're working with on the project. And my experience is that in our North styles, sometimes we put the project ahead of the person. And from the Brazilian side, my experience is they're pretty good at focusing on that person you've been working with and knowing to draw from that person down the road and hoping to draw from that person down the road again. So the example I have for this in the photograph here is that recently we had a guest speaker from Brazil who spoke to my students about the role of a life coach and what a life coach does. And my students had a lot of great questions about the role of a life coach, and especially in Brazil. And so they all wrote letters to this life coach asking about it. And our life coach's response was to be so excited. He said, puxa, me sinto como uma criança que sempre queria uma bicicleta para Natal. E agora vou ganhar uma novinha. Meaning, I felt like a kid at Christmas. I've always wanted a bicycle, and now I find out I'm going to get a brand new one. Why? Because his expectation, given the reaction of all the students, was that we've got a new thing going on here. I've always wanted to work with a group of people like, now I'm going to be able to do this. The problem is that as the semester ends and the students moved on, I'm not really sure these students are going to communicate with him again. At least not in the way that he is expecting, because of just the good vibe that was there while we were working together. And I think a lot of it was precisely because that impression of building this relationship was given because of the informal, casual style that the North Americans have. And then this person, as the life coach, he was excited to keep this rolling. And I just don't think it's going to happen in the way that he's expecting, simply because in the student's mind, when the semester is over, they're moving on to the next semester. Good intentions aside, there probably won't be as many interactions along the way. So I thought a perfect example of the way he, I wouldn't say overreacted, but I could just tell from his reaction that he had an expectation of things moving on that may not move on exactly that way. So what's going on in that case, Deirdre?
So Orlando, that's a beautiful example of
Really
the cultural tendencies that I refer to as network and process orientation. So network orientation involves treating interpersonal relationships as a kind of social currency. So if the broader my social network is, the more people I can call on to do favors and help me out if I need it. And the bigger the number is of people that I owe favors to in return. And so in strongly network environments, people prefer to do business with people who are members of their social network. And once they integrate someone new into their network, that person is going to be introduced to all their friends, and they are vouching for that person, that they're going to be a good member of this network. And so they vet their friends very carefully before they introduce them. And that makes them a little bit formal. They may seem very friendly, at a party, but to be invited home and to have a serious place in someone's social network requires a little thinking on everybody's part. And that's why Americans with our very casual friendships are confusing to them. The behavior that we're exhibiting seems as though we are treating them as part of our social network. And the expectation of people in network environments is that those relationships are for life. And so I've been places where I get a Christmas card for people that I've known, for 40 years from Japan every year. They religiously write me a New Year's card from Japan. Whereas Americans, once they move, across town or to another state, often stop writing their old friends, because they make new ones. So this expectation that relationships are really important is very pronounced in network societies. And the implication for business there is that it's difficult to do business and to have a good relationship without investing in it. Because first of all, a company that you're doing business, that you want to do business with, doesn't owe you anything until you become part of their network. And then if they treat you as part of their network, their expectation is that the relationship is going to go on for a long period of time beyond the deal, because they have beyond the project, beyond the current transaction, because they're going to invest very heavily in it. And they're going to treat you, they're going to prioritize your needs as a member of their social network. Process orientation looks at this and says, if everybody prioritizes members of their social network, that means they're going to hire their nephew. That means they're going to promote their best friend. And there are conflicts of interest there. We want to take that interpersonal element to some degree out of the equation. We want to rely on systems and processes and criteria and structures to make business decisions. So if I'm going to hire somebody, I'm going to post a job description, and it's going to have a lot of detail about what that person needs to be able to do. And then when I have two candidates, I'm going to evaluate them not on the basis of how well I know them, but rather what kind of experience they have and how that fits my job description. And this is a tendency that is quite pronounced in North America. Very, very heavy reliance on systems to make business decisions that involve any kind of interpersonal dealings. So when I came to work for the McCombs School of Business at UT, I actually had to fill out a form stating whether or not I was related to someone at the university. Now, in some places that would be a big plus. Yeah, my aunt works here. Oh, cool. You're gonna fit right in. You're gonna have a mentor here. Your aunt's gonna be able to advocate for you and help you fit into the community. That's great. At the McCombs School of Business, if I had said, yes, my aunt works here, I would then have had to show that my aunt had nothing to do with the fact that I was hired. My aunt there's no conflict of interest. We don't work in the same area. She was not involved in the hiring process and so on. So that is a process-oriented approach to business. So each of these has upsides and downsides. the upside of a network approach is that if you know me, you know all my friends. If you have a problem, all my friends are available to help you solve your problem. If my car breaks down, I don't call Uber, I call my cousin because her daughter is free in the afternoon and can give me a ride to work. And I know this because I keep track of her. And I'm going to do her a favor as soon as I have the opportunity. So I have diverse resources at my fingertips, and I have a great deal of flexibility. And I'm also going to, if you're a member of my network, I'm going to drop what I'm doing. Sorry, boss, I have to leave because my friends need something, right? So I'm going to prioritize the needs of the members of my network. And if you're a member of my network, you benefit from that. The downside is if you're not a member of my network, I may not do that so readily for you. And if you're my boss and you're trying to keep me on the job and I'm running here and there doing favors for people, that may be a downside. The benefit then of process orientation is that we are operating in a much more structured way, in a structured environment, avoiding conflicts of interest. Everybody stays on the job and works the number of hours they're supposed to, and so on. The downside, of course, is that everybody is an island and they are working according to a system. And if that system breaks down for any reason or there are difficulties, then they don't have that personal network to call on. So again, each has advantages and disadvantages, and the synergy between the two is creating an environment on a team, on a collaboration, where you're using rational, fair systems and processes to get things done in a predictable and ethical fashion, while you are still recognizing the importance of relationships and to some degree prioritizing people's needs as human beings.
And one of the sweet things about the example that I just gave is that life coach I was talking about has been a friend of mine for 40 years. And when we started having virtual classes and I needed to invite more people to interact with my students, who did I draw from? That person that's been a friend of mine for 40 years. And I knew he'd be willing to do it. It's just kind of part of that relationship we've had for a long, long time.
All right, super. So you want to summarize here and tell us what you recommend business people do?
Sure. By the way, isn't that a fun picture? It's a joke on the phrase "O que será de nós?" What is going to happen to us? Because the word "us" also looks like the, and so all the chipmunk there is afraid to get the nuts. What's going to happen to us? You know, when we talked about this in the very beginning, we said don't put everybody in the same bag just because they're Brazilian or North American. What this really implies is our ability to look around and observe. And that really is the key to all this. In the same way that you know how to act with that certain uncle or that certain cousin, it's because over time you've observed their preferences and what they like most. And that's exactly what's going to happen whether you work with somebody from Texas or California or Sao Paulo or Rio. Everybody's going to have their different strengths, and we want you to work with those strengths and take advantage of them. You know, have enough humility to say, hey, if this guy is good at this, let him do this. And if I'm weaker at it, I certainly want that help from that other person. Give people that space to be able to shine at what they're best at. And whether they're Brazilian or North American, any team we work with is going to have people of all different abilities and strengths. And the better we are at observing that and then being open to it, the more success we're going to have. It's going to be a great ride. I know in my case, like I've said, I've had 40 years of enjoyable experiences interacting between people in the United States and Brazil. And it's just a rich experience because you get to see how good people are at so many things along the way. So that'd be my recommendations.
Super. And I have a little bit different way of saying some of the same types of things. That synergy, the idea of being able to leverage the strengths of both parties in any kind of collaboration is what you should be going into, the relationship thinking. In the literature on intercultural interaction, international business, cultural difference is often seen as a negative. It's going to cause problems. You're not going to communicate well. There are going to be difficulties along the way. But if you take the position that your partner, just by virtue of being different, is bringing different tools. Now you have your toolbox, and they're adding tools to your toolbox that you don't have. And if you find out, but you can't always see those tools, they're not so easy to spot. But if you investigate and figure out what they are, then you're going to know what strengths they bring, and you'll be able to call on those strengths. At the same time, those people have a little bit different needs than you do. If you tell a flow-oriented person that every Tuesday from 9 to 10, you are going to discuss their latest good idea on a project, you may make them feel like they're in a straitjacket, like they can't breathe. This is how how flow-oriented people describe this to me. And my Brazilian students have said, I don't know if I'm going to have a good idea at 10 o'clock every Tuesday morning. Maybe we should meet at 3 o'clock on Tuesday, or maybe we should meet on Wednesday, or wait till we see when we have a good idea before we meet, And so by understanding what they need, if you could say, well, okay, how about if we're a little bit more flexible about when we're going to have our meetings, and we don't cut them off exactly 1 hour later. If the conversation's still going on, we'll continue a little longer, and we won't schedule anything back to back there, so we can have that kind of open, relaxed conversation. Then you're going to get their best work. If you want their creativity, if you want their ability to solve problems, you have to create an environment in which they're able to do their best work. And then by the same token, they're going to be motivated to do the same thing for you, which creates a win-win situation. So you often hear about cultural compromise. And I don't like that word. That's sort of like coming in and saying, well, I'll give up something that's important to me if you'll give up something that's important to you. And that is not the spirit of cultural synergies. Cultural synergy is about saying, you do something really well, and I want that. And I'm happy to give you what you need so that you can deliver that to me. And I hope you'll do the same thing for me. And if that's the spirit that you use, that you have when you enter into a relationship, that's how you get the best of both approaches, and all the tools in the toolbox everybody can use to the fullest. So I think that is our presentation.
And it looks like there is a question that's already been written in the chat for it. Jump right into it. There's a question of, is there an American equivalent to dar um jeito? And why is this practice less common here? And my answer to that is, it may not be less common here. We just don't have the name for it as much. So there are a couple of things at play. Number one, as an example, Brazil went through a number of years of hyperinflation. You really couldn't predict what the price of something was going to be even tomorrow. And so you have to figure out really quickly, okay, if I can't depend on what the price tomorrow, what do I do? If I ask somebody in Brazil, how much did you pay for these glasses? Whatever number they gave me wouldn't even be relevant anymore. And so I just think that society creates a situation where you're used to doing things on the fly. And that would be my translation for it, to just make it up as you go along, do it on the fly. Now, do we have equivalent in the United States? Totally. Not to make everything a sports analogy, but if somebody is a quarterback of a football team, they've drawn their play, their receiver's supposed to run his route, but sometimes it breaks down. And we always admire this quarterback who can kind of make it up and still have the play work when they are changing what the play was to see how they should react to something that they didn't expect. It's just simply that ability where we admire those who are able to take the plan and then alternate it based on the situations that come. So I really don't buy the idea that we don't have an equivalent. We just don't have an actual phrase, dar um jeito, that's easy to translate. But to admire those that are flexible enough to change plans given current situations, we totally admire that ability and find it all over the place as well. Deirdre, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about a story my brother told me about moving to a very rural area. So he moved from in the US, he moved from a large US city into a very rural area in the mountains of Virginia. And he found that he could never predict when the person was going to come to fix whatever was broken, because it was going to depend on all kinds of things. Whether they had a sick child or their car broke down, or maybe there was the weather was going to get in the way and so on. And people there just don't sweat that stuff. They just go in whatever direction they have to, because they can't rely on the same systems and infrastructure that exist in large cities. So they operate very much, and they're also very network oriented. They're very relationship oriented. They get things done by contacting friends and family and so on. So you can see many of the tendencies that exist in other places that are strongly represented in other countries, anywhere in any other country as well. In the US, there's a huge difference between large urban areas and rural areas. And so you see a lot more of those same patterns, the flow orientation, the network orientation.
And there's always a reason why things kind of develop the way they do. Recently, we were talking to a Brazilian from Belém, and she talked about how they schedule their meetings before and after the rain. And so, because they know that every day the clouds build up and every afternoon there's going to be a rainstorm, they schedule it, let's do it before the rain comes, or let's do it after the rain comes. Now notice how that's very structured, but it's structured for a whole different reason than what we would do in terms of the clock. And so this isn't a matter of flexibility, it's a matter of something local causes us to react a certain way. And I thought that was a beautiful example that we have then, let's meet after the rain.
I have a question, if you're willing to give me some time. And without telling our age, we all started our work in international education before the full expansion of globalization, right? So before 2000, when maybe there were not as many opportunities to study abroad, fewer opportunities to travel abroad. Now in this century, we have seen immigration in moving people, families moving back and forth. Everyone has a family member there, here. You have social media, you have people joining collective conversation in different languages. You have people in next watching live streaming, which used to be dubbed in Spanish and Portuguese. Now they watch it directly in English, right? So there's much more opportunity for informal linkages. That means that this cultural difference have decreased compared to last century. Have you noticed there's more similarities, the way we do business, the way we interact with each other?
I think what you will find is that in urban centers, there's a lot of similarity across the world, but there may be tremendous difference between, for example, let's say a New York investment banker and a Mississippi potato farmer may have very, very little in common. Whereas that New York investment banker and a Sao Paulo investment banker may have quite a lot in common. So I would not say that cultural difference has diminished, but it's found maybe in different places and in different contexts. I would say it's as rich as it has ever been, and perhaps more important than it's ever been. Orlando, what's your take on that?
Well, we are in an academic situation right now. Academic people look at things and label things. We just talked about the word network and process and directness and indirectness. Outside of that academic circle, though, a lot of what we do, we can't actually label and identify and aren't even aware of. And so all of these things that you and I are calling cultural issues and cross-cultural communication, well, for most of the people, it's just being themselves, being normal. And there really isn't that same awareness even of what this might mean in terms of a cultural difference. One of the advantages, I think, of education is that we do become aware of things and it helps us observe them and see them, where those who have never even learned about it may not make that connection. That's our hope in education, that as we become aware of these and observe them, we then can implement it in the ways we've been talking about today, take the strengths of both sides. If we've never learned to observe that, we won't even know that's a strength or not. And so I think, to answer your question, those kind of issues are so much below the surface that we don't have an awareness of them. And so I don't think that just because we communicate with technology in a new way, automatically dispels all of those under the surface sort of things that we don't notice very well. It still, I think, is one of the advantages of saying that education has its benefits when we learn to observe and identify those sort of things and then react to them. And that's kind of what we hope, because that's the job we're in.
Yeah, I think the natural tendency studies show is to perceive our own behavior and the norms that we've been taught. First of all, we don't recognize that we were taught norms. We just think what we're doing is normal. And then when we encounter someone who's doing it differently, our perception is that those people are weird. But we kind of go further than weird a lot of times and give it a label, right? So they're not just weird, they're lazy, or they're rude, or they're uncommitted, or they're dishonest, right? So there's some of the judgments that I described. Schedule people think that flow people are uncommitted. The sad thing about that is that those judgments are always wrong, because they are not based on what on the a correct interpretation of people's motives. The judgments are always made viewed through our own cultural screen. So I think that speaks to the importance of education and the idea of not making assumptions and going in and finding out where people really are coming from.
Yeah, a good example of that, Deirdre, is I remember once hearing a North American complain to me that Brazilian pizza wasn't like real Italian pizza. And I was thinking, you're North American. Your pizza doesn't taste anything like pizza in Italy either.
Yeah.
His perception was that our pizza is real pizza and the Brazilian pizza is not real pizza. The perfect example of had no awareness that maybe his own American pizza wasn't similar to a pizza in Italy either. Although
That's a great example.
Although I will add that Brazilians tend to give you little packages of ketchup whenever you buy pizza. And I've never understood why somebody would put ketchup on a pizza. But a great example, wasn't it?
I love that example.
Well, Paloma, how are we doing time-wise here?
We are doing fine. I have more questions if you want to keep going. So the other question I have is, coming from the Spanish-speaking country to study in the US, I have the cultural shock when I have to write my first academic paper, because they were so focused on goals and getting to the point from the very beginning. I'm going to demonstrate this and I'm going to conclude that. And from my perspective, that felt very rude to unveil so much at the beginning. We like to walk around and tell you at the end what we conclude. I imagine it's the same in Brazil. It's a very different way to write academic papers. Is that so?
Yeah, that's so interesting, Paloma. That is characteristic of network orientation. So the way that network-oriented people provide information is to start with a story and to get to the point rather late and engage the listener and provide examples and so on. And there's a North American formula for giving people information. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I tell you what I told you. And it's almost a gospel kind of thing that Americans think that they're supposed to do. And so many of these business practices that work really well and are taught in the US are actually rather, as you say, rude. And by the way, if you've told me twice, if you tell me a third time, that's kind of insulting, right? But that's a process orientation is all about getting the value across, getting the information provided. And so I can easily imagine that my Brazilian students, interestingly, they write very, very creative papers. Frequently, however, they have not paid very close attention to the instructions. And so the papers are really hard to grade because they're being so creative. And that is a function of another cultural tendency that I refer to as situation orientation, where you're not prioritizing the rules. Rules are sort of secondary, they're sort of guidelines. Whereas, in the US, we're very focused on rules. Orlando, what's your observation there?
In a similar vein, Paloma, not so much writing papers, but I've had the experience a number of times where not just Brazil, but many people in Latin America have asked me to write a letter of reference for somebody's child. And I will say, I've never met your son. I've never met your daughter. And they will say, oh, it doesn't matter. I just need you to write the letter because you are a professor at the University of Texas. And if we could have a letter from a professor at the University of Texas, that'll be very helpful for my son or my daughter. And it's that same issue of, it kind of doesn't work that way, that I would like to know your son or daughter before I wrote a letter of reference for them. It's a very similar issue that you had, Paloma. That was a fun one. Good question.
Well, I don't think we have seen more questions in the chat. I don't know if you would like to give some concluding remarks before we close, but I think it was really interesting for people who are planning to come to study here to hear these perspectives.
Well, my final comment is that, it's a little nerve-wracking to give a presentation knowing that both Brazilians and North Americans will be part of the audience. And are we going to say something that one side or the other is going to go, what did that guy just say? The bottom line is this. We have all had years and years of experience interacting between North Americans and Brazilians. The experience has been a delight because exactly what we bring to the table and the other strengths of other people, and especially in the case of Brazilians, you have a country that is so diverse in terms of its economy, its location, beaches, mountains, Amazon, freezing cold weather outside, education levels. I mean, all the things that come to make Brazil so complex in terms of all the different things that have to come together for that country to work. And they have the exact same experience with us. They come to a Texas versus a California versus a Florida, and they have that same experience of having it all come together. That's really where the delight comes. And what we were hoping is that with this presentation, you get a few more tools to be able to observe some of those things and identify them, and then be able to say, now I know what's happening. I need to take advantage of this. Deirdre?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with all of that. And then again, the idea that this is an adventure, that achieving cultural synergy is going to yield benefits that go far beyond what you can imagine, as well as fantastic friendships and new tools and new methods, new ways of dealing with the world that you hadn't thought of before. And so if you think of it as an opportunity instead of a negative, intercultural business is just the greatest gift there can possibly be. So I hope everyone is able to enter into international relationships in the spirit of fun and adventure.
Thank you so much to both of you. You have given us a lot to think, and we will be reposting this video on YouTube too for other people to use it later. Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you, Orlando.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deirdre. Fun to be with you again.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.